Hi guys, the winter evening has already settled over the small medieval village. Beyond the low roofs, the fields lie quiet beneath a pale sky. The last light has disappeared behind the bare trees, and the narrow paths between the houses have become dark and soft with mud. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden door closes. Then another. A dog moves briefly across a yard before disappearing into the shadows. Smoke rises slowly from the chimneys, spreading into the cold air and hanging above the village like a thin gray blanket. Inside the houses, people are beginning to settle for the long night. There is no need to hurry. Winter has its own pace. The days are short, and darkness arrives early. The fields are resting beneath the cold earth. The tools of summer have been cleaned and put away. The heavy work of harvesting is finished. The grain has been carried inside. Firewood has been stacked beside the walls. Bundles of dried herbs hang from wooden beams. Baskets of onions and roots sit in quiet corners. Somewhere near the hearth, a pot is warming slowly over the fire. And for many ordinary people in medieval Europe, these long winter days were filled with simple things. There was work, certainly. There was always work. But it was different from the work of summer. There were fewer hours beneath the open sky. Fewer journeys across the fields. Fewer mornings when a person needed to rise before sunrise and remain outside until the evening light faded. Winter narrowed the world. A family might spend much of the day inside the same small room. The walls were thick. The windows were small. A little light came through them, but not much. In some houses, the openings were covered with wooden shutters or cloth, and glass was rare. The hearth became the center of life. Around it, people cooked, repaired clothing, shaped tools, prepared food, talked quietly, and waited for the daylight to return. Imagine waking there. It is still dark. The fire has burned low during the night, leaving a bed of dull embers beneath the ash. The room is cold away from the hearth. Your breath may be visible in the air. You remain beneath the rough wool blanket for a few moments longer, listening to the house. There is the soft breathing of other sleepers. The faint crackle of a coal. The wind moving against the roof. Perhaps rain touches the thatch. Perhaps snow has gathered outside. Winter morning has arrived, but there is no bright sunlight pouring through a wide window. Instead, there is darkness. And for a little while, the household remains still. This was one of the quiet realities of medieval winter life. For people who lived by the seasons, winter was not simply a colder version of summer. It changed the rhythm of nearly everything. The fields became quieter. Roads became difficult. Travel slowed. Animals needed care. Food had to be protected. Firewood became precious. Clothing needed repair. Roofs needed attention. Tools had to be maintained. And inside the darkness of the early morning, small tasks waited. A person might rise to stir the fire. Someone might add a few pieces of wood. Someone else might begin preparing the first food of the day. The sound of a knife against a wooden board could be heard in the half-light. A pot might be placed near the flames. Water, brought inside from a well or stored in a vessel, would be warmed carefully. There was no need for the morning to begin quickly. The winter day itself was short. There was time. Outside, the village was slowly waking. A farmer might step into the yard and feel the cold earth beneath his feet. The air would be sharp against his face. The animals would need attention. Chickens would be fed. Cattle would be checked. A horse might be given hay. Pigs might be fed scraps or grain. Even when the fields were resting, the animals could not rest completely. They still needed food. They still needed water. They still needed shelter. A medieval winter morning could therefore begin with the quiet sounds of livestock. The low movement of cattle in a barn. The rustling of straw. The occasional knock of a wooden bucket. The soft voice of someone speaking to an animal. Then the door would close again. Warmth would return. The hearth would glow. And another winter day would begin. For a farming family, the winter months were often a time of waiting, but waiting did not mean doing nothing. The great pressure of harvest had passed, yet the household remained busy. Grain had to be measured. Flour had to be prepared. Bread had to be baked. Clothing had to be mended. Wool had to be spun. Wood had to be cut. Tools had to be repaired. Seeds had to be kept safe for the coming season. Food had to be watched carefully, because there would be no new harvest for many months. In the quiet of winter, a household lived from what it had already gathered. The stores of autumn were now becoming the food of winter. A family might have sacks of grain, dried peas, beans, onions, salted meat, smoked fish, apples stored carefully away, and perhaps preserved vegetables. The exact foods depended on the region, the harvest, the wealth of the family, and the local land. For some, there was enough. For others, there was never quite enough. But across many villages, the same basic rhythm could be felt. The food was simple. The meals were repetitive. The cooking was slow. A pot might remain over the fire for much of the day. Grain and vegetables could simmer together into a thick porridge or stew. Pieces of cabbage, onion, leek, pea, or turnip might be added. If the household had meat available, a little might be included. Often the flavor came from whatever had been stored during the warmer months. The smell of cooking filled the small room. Smoke drifted toward the roof. The fire breathed softly. Someone stirred the pot. Someone else kneaded dough. The bread was placed near the heat. And outside, the winter morning remained pale and quiet. There was something gentle about the repetition. Every day did not need to be different. For many people, the rhythm of life was built from things that had to be done again and again. The same fire. The same pot. The same wooden table. The same tools. The same familiar walls. The same faces waking beneath the same rough blankets. Winter made these repetitions even more noticeable. There were long hours when there was little reason to leave the house. The fields did not need constant attention. The roads were unpleasant. The weather could be wet, icy, or snowy. So people turned toward work that could be done indoors. This was when the house became a workshop. A farmer might repair a broken handle. A wooden bowl might be scraped and smoothed. A piece of leather could be cut and stitched. A shoe could be repaired. A wooden tool could be reshaped. A fence might be repaired one piece at a time. The work was practical. There was no need to make it beautiful. It simply needed to last. A household depended upon its tools. A broken axe handle was not merely inconvenient. A damaged plow, worn harness, cracked bucket, or torn shoe could create difficulties later. Winter offered time to prepare. The person sitting near the hearth might hold a piece of wood in both hands, turning it slowly while examining its shape. A knife would shave away thin curls of wood. The curls would fall onto the floor. The sound would be soft. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. The fire would crackle nearby. Perhaps someone would be spinning wool. The spindle would turn. The thread would grow. A child might sit close to the warmth, watching the adults work. Outside, the wind would move across the village. Inside, the hours would pass quietly. For some people, winter was also the season for spinning and weaving. Clothing was too important to neglect. Wool had to be cleaned and prepared. Fibers were drawn out slowly and twisted into thread. A spindle could turn for hours while a person sat near the fire. The movement was repetitive. The hands learned the rhythm. Pull. Twist. Turn. Wind. Again. The work did not require constant conversation. It could continue while people talked softly. It could continue while someone prepared food. It could continue while a child slept. It could continue while snow gathered outside. In this way, winter time could be filled with small movements. A hand turning a spindle. A knife shaping wood. A needle passing through cloth. A spoon stirring a pot. A broom moving across a dirt floor. A door opening. A door closing. These sounds made up part of the ordinary music of a medieval home. And perhaps the most important sound of all was the fire. The hearth was warmth. It was light. It was cooking. It was comfort. Without it, winter was much harder. Firewood had been gathered earlier in the year, and the household needed to use it carefully. A fire that burned too strongly could consume wood quickly. A fire that burned too weakly could leave the room cold. So the flames were watched. A piece of wood might be added. Ash might be moved aside. A burning log might be pushed closer together with a metal tool or a piece of wood. The fire would brighten. For a moment, the walls would glow orange. Then the flames would settle again. In some homes, the smoke did not leave efficiently. The air inside could be hazy, especially when the fire was burning strongly. People lived with smoke because there were few alternatives. The warmth gathered around the hearth. The corners remained cold. Someone sitting close to the fire might feel comfortable while another person only a few steps away remained wrapped in a heavy cloak. This made the arrangement of the room important. The warmest place belonged naturally to those who needed it. An elderly person might sit close to the flames. A child might sleep near the hearth. Someone preparing food would remain beside the fire for much of the day. Others might work farther away. The house was small enough that everyone could hear everyone else. There was little private space. The winter months made this especially clear. Family members shared the same air, the same warmth, the same food, and often the same sleeping space. At night, several people might sleep together in one room. Beds were not always the separate wooden structures we imagine today. Depending on wealth and place, sleeping arrangements could be simple. Straw-filled mattresses, blankets, wool coverings, benches, pallets, or wooden frames might be used. The straw inside a mattress could become flattened over time. It might need to be replaced. The bedding could be rough. The room could be cold. Yet after a long winter day, sleep came naturally. The body had been working. The eyes had spent hours in dim light. The fire had made the room warm enough. Outside, darkness covered the village. And there was little reason to remain awake late. Winter nights were long. But even before sleep, there was usually more work. Dinner had to be prepared. Animals had to be checked. Tools had to be put away. The fire had to be watched. The door had to be secured. Water might need to be brought inside. The household had its small evening rituals. Perhaps bread was broken and shared. Perhaps a warm stew was eaten from a common bowl. Perhaps someone spoke quietly about the weather. The next morning's work might be discussed. A roof might need repair. A trip to a nearby market might be planned. A neighbor might have asked for help. A piece of clothing might need to be finished. Nothing sounded urgent. The winter world moved slowly. In villages where snow covered the ground, that slowness became even stronger. Footprints appeared on the path and remained there. The surface of the fields became pale. Branches held snow. The roofs grew white. Smoke from chimneys rose into the cold sky. The village seemed smaller. Sounds carried differently. A distant axe striking wood could be heard across the still air. One strike. Then silence. Another strike. Then silence again. A person walking along a frozen path might hear the crunch of their own footsteps. There might be no carts passing. No crowds. No busy field workers. Only winter. For a farmer, this was a season when the land itself seemed to sleep. The plowed fields waited. The seeds were hidden beneath the earth. The trees stood bare. The grass was short and wet or buried under frost. The work of spring was still far away. And because it was far away, there was time to prepare. Seeds needed to be checked. Tools needed to be repaired. Animals needed to remain healthy. Fences needed to be strengthened. Wood needed to be shaped. Clothing needed to be made ready. The coming year was always quietly present in the winter household. Even while people rested from the harvest, they were preparing for another one. The medieval year was a circle. Summer became autumn. Autumn became winter. Winter became spring. The same fields returned to work. The same tools were lifted. The same paths were walked. And in winter, the circle seemed to pause for a while. This pause was not empty. It was filled with maintenance. With preparation. With waiting. With simple indoor labor. And sometimes, with storytelling. Long evenings offered opportunities for people to sit together. There might be stories about ancestors, saints, distant places, local events, old customs, strange weather, family memories, or journeys that had happened years before. Not every household had books. Not every person could read. Written words were precious and often belonged to churches, monasteries, wealthy households, or trained scribes. So much knowledge traveled through memory and speech. An older person might tell a child the name of a field. A mother might teach a daughter a household task. A father might show a son how to repair a tool. A craftsman might teach an apprentice by demonstration. The winter evening became a quiet classroom. There was no need for a formal lesson. The knowledge was simply woven into ordinary life. Watch this. Hold the thread here. Cut the wood this way. Do not waste the flour. Keep the fire low. Feed the animal before you close the door. Small instructions passed from one generation to another. And while these things happened, the night grew deeper. The fire became the brightest thing in the room. Faces appeared in the orange light. Hands moved. Shadows shifted across the walls. The wind pressed gently against the roof. The whole house seemed to breathe. In some places, winter also brought work in workshops. Villages and towns were not entirely silent. Smiths continued their work. Carpenters worked indoors or beneath sheltered roofs. Leather workers continued preparing hides. Weavers worked at looms. Potters shaped clay when conditions allowed. Masons might work when the weather permitted, although outdoor construction could slow considerably. A town could still be active during winter. But the rhythm changed. The streets were wetter. The daylight was shorter. Clothing became heavier. Travel became harder. People kept closer to home when they could. A merchant preparing for a journey might wait for better weather. A farmer going to market might leave later in the morning. A craftsman might spend longer hours inside. And the market itself, when it took place, could feel very different beneath a winter sky. People stood in thick clothing. Breath appeared in the cold. Wooden stalls were damp. Baskets were filled with stored foods rather than fresh summer produce. There might be onions, dried peas, grain, salted fish, eggs, cheese, apples, nuts, and other preserved foods. People came to buy what they needed. Then they returned home. The winter market was not a place to linger unnecessarily. The warmth of the house was waiting. For those who lived near forests, winter brought another familiar task. Wood. The household needed it constantly. A person might spend part of the day cutting branches or splitting logs. The work was physical, but the winter air kept the body cool. An axe rose. It came down. Wood split. The sound traveled through the trees. Then another piece was placed on the ground. The process continued. Afterward, the person might carry the wood home in small loads. The path between forest and village became familiar. Perhaps snow covered the ground. Perhaps the earth was wet and brown. Perhaps the trees dripped after rain. The journey was not far, but it had to be repeated. Back at the house, the wood would be stacked beside the wall. Each piece represented warmth for another evening. Another pot of food. Another morning. Another night. Winter made people aware of such small necessities. A loaf of bread was not simply bread. It was grain that had been grown, harvested, stored, ground, mixed with water, shaped, and baked. A warm room was not simply warmth. It was wood gathered earlier, carried home, dried, split, and burned carefully. A wool blanket was not simply a blanket. It represented sheep, shearing, cleaning, spinning, weaving, and sewing. Nearly everything had a long history before it reached the hands of the person using it. And during the long winter months, people lived among the results of their earlier work. The harvest was in the granary. The wool was in the clothing. The wood was beside the hearth. The preserved food was in storage. The tools were hanging from walls or resting beneath benches. Winter was the season when all these preparations became part of everyday life. There were also days when the weather was too harsh for ordinary outdoor work. On such mornings, people might remain indoors longer. The animals would still be fed. The fire would still be tended. But the rest of the day could become remarkably quiet. A person might sit near the hearth repairing clothing. Another might work with wool. Someone might clean grain. A child might watch the flames. The house would remain dim. Outside, snow might fall steadily. There was nowhere important to go. The world could wait. This is perhaps one of the most peaceful images of medieval winter life. A small house. A low fire. A few people sitting together. Simple work in their hands. Cold darkness beyond the walls. The hours passing slowly. No need for every moment to contain something new. The same piece of cloth could be repaired for an hour. The same spindle could turn again and again. The same pot could simmer until evening. And while the people inside worked, the winter landscape remained almost unchanged. The trees stood still. The fields waited. The road remained empty. Smoke drifted upward. The day moved toward darkness. For wealthier households, winter could be more comfortable, though comfort varied greatly by place and period. Large houses might have several rooms, servants, storage spaces, kitchens, and better supplies of fuel and food. Thick walls could protect against the wind. More fireplaces could provide warmth. But even in a wealthy household, winter required planning. Food had to be stored. Animals had to be cared for. Servants had work to do. Candles and fuel had to be managed. Clothing needed cleaning and repair. People still lived according to the light of the season. In a castle or manor, the winter day could be filled with administration and household tasks. Scribes might sit at desks, copying documents, or recording accounts. Their work required patience. A quill moved slowly across parchment. Ink was kept nearby. The page had to be handled carefully. The writing room might be cold, so the scribe could sit near a fire when possible. The work was quiet. There was the soft scratching of the pen, the movement of a sleeve, the occasional turning of a page. Outside the window, winter light faded early. A scribe might continue until the light became too weak, then set the work aside. In monasteries, winter had its own rhythm as well. The days were shaped by prayer, work, reading, meals, and rest. Monks could spend time copying manuscripts, tending gardens when weather allowed, preparing food, caring for animals, maintaining buildings, or performing other necessary tasks. The monastery itself could become a quiet world enclosed by walls. Snow might settle on the roof. The courtyard might remain empty. The stone corridors could feel cold. Candles flickered in dark rooms. Footsteps echoed softly. The winter air entered through narrow openings. And somewhere, perhaps in a kitchen, a fire burned steadily. The same seasonal pattern reached into many parts of medieval society. Winter did not stop life. It compressed it. People came indoors. Work became smaller and closer. The household became more important. The fire became more important. Food stores became more important. Time itself seemed to move more slowly. And perhaps this is why the winter day could feel so long. Not because every hour was difficult, but because there were so many hours. The sun rose late. The sun disappeared early. Between those two moments, there was a great deal of quiet. A person might wake before dawn and remain awake until evening. The light outside changed gradually. Gray morning. Pale afternoon. Dark evening. And through it all, the same small room remained around them. A beam overhead. A wooden bench. A hearth. A pot. A few tools. Bundles of cloth. Baskets. A door. Perhaps a small window. These familiar objects became companions during the winter. The household knew every corner. Every creaking board. Every place where cold air entered. Every spot beside the hearth where the warmth was strongest. Every sound made by the roof during rain. Every sound made by the wind. There was comfort in familiarity. And for people whose lives were closely tied to the land, familiarity was important. They knew the fields. They knew the woods. They knew the river. They knew which path became muddy after rain. They knew where water gathered. They knew which tree provided good wood. They knew where animals were likely to shelter. They knew the seasons. Winter was not an interruption to this knowledge. It was part of it. A farmer understood that the field needed rest. A shepherd understood that animals needed shelter. A household understood that food had to last. A craftsperson understood that tools had to be maintained. A child gradually learned all of these things simply by living among them. The winter days taught patience. Not through formal instruction, just through repetition. Morning came. Work began. The fire burned. Food was prepared. Clothing was repaired. Animals were fed. Darkness arrived. The household ate. The fire was reduced. People prepared for sleep. Then morning came again. Outside, the fields waited beneath the cold sky. And slowly, quietly, another winter day began. The morning arrives almost without announcing itself. There is no bright edge of sunlight across the floor yet. The room remains gray, and the hearth has settled into a quiet bed of ash. Somewhere beneath the blankets, someone shifts in sleep. A wooden beam gives a small creak as the cold air moves through the house. Then comes the first movement. A hand reaches toward the hearth. The ashes are disturbed. A few red embers appear. Dry twigs are placed carefully among them, followed by a small piece of wood. For a moment, nothing happens. Then a thin flame appears. It grows slowly. The room begins to change. The darkness near the hearth becomes brown and orange. Faces can be seen again. The walls seem to move as the firelight flickers across them. This was one of the quiet beginnings of a medieval winter day. For people living close to the seasons, the first task of the morning was often simply to make the house livable again. The cold had returned during the night. Even if the fire had been kept alive, its warmth was weak by dawn. A new fire meant another day could begin. Water might be warmed. Bread might be cut. A pot might be placed over the flames. Someone might begin preparing the morning meal. There was little need for variety. The food of winter was often built from what could be stored. Bread, porridge, cheese, beans, peas, vegetables kept in cellars or storage pits, dried fruit when available, salted or smoked foods, perhaps eggs, perhaps a little meat. The meal depended on the household. For a poor family, the winter table could be very plain. For a wealthy household, there might be more choices. But even where food was abundant, winter still encouraged careful use. There would be no fresh harvest tomorrow. The grain in the storehouse had to last. The dried peas had to last. The salted meat had to last. Everything had its place in the long calculation of the year. A person might look at a sack of grain and understand that it represented months of food. The same grain that had been harvested during the warm months was now being transformed into daily meals. A little at a time. One loaf. One bowl. One day. And then another. The rhythm could be comforting because it was predictable. Winter did not ask for great changes. It asked people to continue. The first light eventually reaches the village. It touches the tops of the bare trees. It turns the frost pale. The roofs remain dark. Smoke rises from several houses. Some people are already outside. A farmer walks toward the barn. His clothing is thick. His hands are covered as well as the household can manage. The ground is hard in places and soft in others. He opens the barn door. Warm, animal-scented air comes toward him. The animals have been waiting. Hay is brought down. A wooden trough is filled. Water is checked. The animals move slowly. Their breath hangs in the cold air. The farmer stays for a while. There is no way to hurry these things. The animals must be fed every day, regardless of weather. Even when snow covers the fields, even when rain falls for hours, Even when the road outside is empty, the animals still need their food. This is one of the quiet truths of winter. Some work cannot be postponed. The cattle need feeding. The fire needs tending. The water needs carrying. The food needs preparing. The house needs cleaning. The body needs clothing. And because these tasks repeat, they become almost automatic. Hands remember. Feet know the path. The same bucket is carried from the same place. The same door is opened. The same latch is lifted. A person may perform the task while thinking about something else. Perhaps the coming spring. Perhaps a neighbor. Perhaps nothing at all. The mind can become quiet during repetitive work. The body moves. The day passes. Inside the house, another part of winter life is already beginning. Someone is preparing wool. The fibers are pulled apart carefully. The spindle waits nearby. A small bundle is held between the fingers. The thread is drawn out. The spindle turns. The thread twists. It grows longer. This simple motion might continue for a very long time. Spinning was not something that needed to happen quickly. It could fill the empty spaces between other tasks. A person could spin while sitting near the fire. They could talk. They could listen. They could watch a child. They could wait for bread to bake. The hands continued moving. The thread continued growing. Winter provided many such hours. The work of the household was divided into countless small pieces. One task ended. Another began. Nothing seemed dramatic. Yet together, these tasks kept the household alive. A medieval home was not simply a place where people slept. It was a place where almost everything necessary for life was produced, repaired, stored, cooked, and maintained. The walls held warmth. The hearth produced heat and food. The floor collected straw, dirt, ash, and pieces of material. The roof protected the household from rain and snow. The shelves held bowls, jars, tools, and food. The storage area protected grain. The sleeping place held blankets and straw. The whole house was part of the work. Winter made this especially obvious. During summer, much of life spilled outside. People worked in fields. Animals grazed. Clothes were washed. Food could be prepared outdoors. Children could move around yards and paths. Neighbors crossed fields and roads. But winter pulled many of these activities indoors. The house became smaller. The family became closer. The hours became longer. And the hearth became the center of everything. The firelight was not only practical. It also marked the passing of time. When the fire was bright, work could continue. When it became weak, more fuel was needed. When the flames disappeared, the day was nearly finished. Candlelight might extend the evening in wealthier homes, but candles were valuable. They were not something to burn carelessly. A person might work close to the hearth instead. The fire itself gave enough light for simple tasks. A needle could be threaded. A piece of wood could be shaped. A bowl could be cleaned. A spindle could be turned. But detailed work could become difficult as darkness deepened. So the winter evening gradually became quieter. The household began to slow. There was another meal. Then perhaps some conversation. Then the fire was arranged for the night. Blankets were prepared. Doors were checked. Animals were settled. The room became darker. And people went to sleep. But before the evening arrives, there are many hours to pass. One of the most familiar winter activities was food preparation. Bread was central to life in many medieval households. The grain had already been harvested. Now it had to be turned into flour. Depending on the household, grain could be ground by hand using a quern, or taken to a mill where water or wind might provide the power. The sound of grinding could become part of village life. Stone moved against stone. Grain disappeared beneath the pressure. Flour gathered. It was dusty work. Fine particles settled on hands and clothing. The flour was then mixed with water. Dough was kneaded. The movement was slow and physical. Press. Fold. Turn. Press again. A person might lean over the table, working the dough with both hands. The dough became smoother. Then it was shaped. The oven had already been heated. The bread was placed inside. The smell slowly filled the room. Warm grain. Smoke. Wood. The scent of fresh bread was one of the few small luxuries that could make an ordinary winter day feel especially gentle. A loaf came from the oven. Its crust was hard and warm. Steam escaped when it was broken. People waited for it to cool enough to eat. There might be no need for anything else. Bread and a warm bowl of stew could be enough. The meal was simple. But after hours of cold air and work, simple food could feel deeply satisfying. The winter table did not need to be crowded. It needed to be dependable. And dependability mattered. A household survived through preparation. During autumn, food had been gathered. During winter, it was consumed carefully. Nothing could be wasted without reason. Even scraps could have another use. Vegetable pieces could go into a pot. Bones could flavor broth. Old bread could be softened. Animal fat could be saved. Ash could be used in household tasks. Cloth could be patched. Wood could be reused. A broken object might not be thrown away. It might be repaired. The winter months encouraged this kind of care. There was time to fix things. There was also a reason to fix them. New things were not always easily available. A pair of shoes might be repaired many times. A wooden bowl might be used for years. A cloak might pass from one person to another. A tool might be reshaped rather than replaced. The same object could carry traces of many seasons. Scratches. Darkened wood. Worn handles. Patched fabric. The marks of hands. The marks of work. These were ordinary objects, but they were deeply connected to daily life. A person might know a particular knife by its shape. A child might know which spoon belonged to the family. A farmer might recognize his own tool by the worn place on the handle. The winter house was filled with these familiar things. And because the days were long, there was time to notice them. A craftsman in a village might spend much of winter working indoors. A carpenter could sit beneath a roof and shape boards. The smell of fresh cut wood would fill the workshop. Shavings covered the floor. A plane moved across the surface. Long curls of wood fell away. The board became smoother. Again and again, the tool passed across the grain. The craftsman worked slowly. The cold remained outside. Inside, the smell of wood mixed with smoke. Nearby, someone might be repairing a cart. A wheel needed attention. A wooden peg had broken. A handle was loose. Winter was a season for restoring the things that had survived the busy months. The same was true of metal tools. A blacksmith's work could continue through winter. The forge provided heat. The sound of hammer against metal carried through the workshop. But even here, the rhythm was steady rather than hurried. Metal was heated. Placed on the anvil. Struck. Turned. Struck again. The fire glowed. Smoke rose. The hammer lifted. The hammer fell. There was something almost meditative in such repeated movement. The craftsman knew the work by touch. The shape changed little by little. Outside, the winter day remained pale. Inside, sparks briefly appeared and vanished. For apprentices, winter was another season of learning. They watched. They carried materials. They cleaned tools. They practiced. A young person could spend years learning a craft. There was no quick path. Skill grew slowly. The hands learned through repetition. Winter provided countless hours for this kind of learning. The same action might be practiced hundreds of times. The same mistake might be corrected. The same tool might be held again and again. A craft was built from patience. And patience was one of the qualities winter seemed to demand from everyone. Even travel required patience. A road that was easy in summer could become difficult in winter. Rain turned it to mud. Snow covered it. Ice made walking dangerous. Rivers could swell. Bridges could become slippery. A cart could sink into soft ground. For ordinary people, this meant that journeys were often planned carefully. If a market was nearby, someone might go. If a distant town was necessary, the trip could take longer. Merchants still traveled. Messengers still traveled. Pilgrims still traveled. Armies could still move. But winter made every journey harder. For most villagers, there was usually little reason to travel far unless necessary. The village itself contained most of what was familiar. The well. The church. The fields. The woods. The mill. The homes of neighbors. Perhaps a small market. Perhaps an inn. Perhaps a manor house. A person could live much of their life within a small area. Winter strengthened the sense of place. The world beyond the village seemed distant. The road disappeared into trees. The horizon was hidden by mist or snow. People stayed close. Neighbors became important. If a roof leaked, someone might help. If a tool broke, a nearby craftsperson could repair it. If a family became ill, neighbors might bring food or help with animals. The medieval village was not always peaceful or kind. People argued. Communities had conflicts. Poverty and hardship were real. But daily life still depended heavily on cooperation. A person could not easily do everything alone. The winter season made this dependence visible. A household might need another household. A farmer might need the smith. The smith might need the farmer's food. The miller needed grain. The baker needed flour. The merchant moved goods. The shepherd provided wool. The weaver turned wool into cloth. The carpenter repaired wood. Each occupation connected to another. The village formed a web of ordinary needs. And through winter, that web continued quietly. At midday, the light outside was at its strongest. But in winter, strongest did not mean bright. The sun might remain low. The sky could be white or gray. If snow covered the ground, the entire landscape might seem strangely bright despite the cold. The fields stretched outward. The bare trees stood in groups. The village roofs rose from the pale landscape. Smoke moved slowly above them. A person might stand outside for a moment, looking across the fields. There would be little movement. Perhaps a bird crossed the sky. Perhaps a cart passed on the road. Perhaps a farmer returned from the barn. Then the person would go back inside. The warmth of the hearth waited. there was still work to do. Winter afternoons could become long. A family might sit together repairing clothing. A torn sleeve was examined. The cloth was turned inside out. A needle moved through it. Thread passed through the fabric. The tear slowly disappeared. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. The goal was simply to make the clothing useful again. Clothing was precious because it protected the body. A person who worked outdoors needed warmth. Wool was especially valuable in cold weather. Linen could be worn in layers. Leather protected the feet. A cloak could shield the shoulders. Hats and hoods helped against wind. People learned to dress according to their circumstances. The poorest might have fewer layers. The wealthy could own more clothing and better fabrics. But everyone understood the importance of staying warm. In a small house, people might sit close together partly because of this. The warmth of the fire was limited. The warmth of other bodies mattered too. At night, sleeping together beneath heavy coverings provided some protection from the cold. The sleeping room might be dark and quiet. There might be the smell of straw, wool, smoke, and wood. The sounds of the house became softer. A cough. A turning body. A creaking bed. A dog moving nearby. The wind outside. Then silence again. Winter nights were not always peaceful. Storms could be frightening. Cold could be dangerous. Illness could spread easily in crowded homes. Food could become scarce. A household might worry about whether its stores would last until spring. Yet much of ordinary winter life was simply the slow management of these realities. Keep the fire burning. Keep the animals fed. Keep the roof intact. Keep the food dry. Keep the clothing repaired. Keep going. There was no grand solution. There was only the next task. And then the next. This is how long winter days passed for many medieval people. Not through extraordinary events, but through hundreds of ordinary actions. A door opened. A bucket was carried. A fire was fed. A loaf was baked. A thread was spun. A tool was repaired. A child was wrapped in wool. An animal was given hay. A roof was patched. A pot was stirred. A candle was extinguished. The day continued. And slowly, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, evening returned. The light outside began to disappear. The bare trees became dark shapes. The snow, where there was snow, turned blue-gray. Smoke became harder to see. Inside the house, the fire became brighter by comparison. Someone brought another piece of wood. It was placed carefully among the coals. The flames rose. The room warmed. The evening meal was prepared. A pot simmered. Bread was broken. Hands were washed as best as possible. People gathered. The winter day had been long. But it had been full. Not full of noise. Not full of great events. Full of small things. And sometimes, that was enough. After the meal, there might be another hour of work. A piece of clothing needed finishing. A tool needed one last repair. A basket needed weaving. A little more wool could be spun. The firelight allowed some work to continue. But eventually, the hands became tired. The tools were put away. The thread was wound. The needle was stored. The wood shavings were pushed aside. The bowls were cleaned. The last food was covered. The animals were checked once more. Then the household grew quiet. Outside, the village had almost disappeared into darkness. One by one, the lights in the houses became smaller. The winter wind moved through the empty paths. A thin line of smoke rose from the roofs. The church stood dark against the sky. The fields were hidden. The forest was silent. And inside one small home, the fire continued to glow. Someone sat close to it for a final few moments. The warmth touched their hands. The room was quiet. The long winter day was nearly finished. But tomorrow would be much the same. Another pale morning. Another fire. Another bowl. Another piece of wood. Another quiet task waiting near the hearth. And beyond the walls, beneath the cold earth, the fields remained still, holding the promise of a season that was not yet ready to return. The fire has settled into a low orange glow. Most of the household is quiet now. The work of the evening has been put away. The bowls have been cleaned. The tools have been returned to their places. The last pieces of wood have been arranged near the hearth so they will be ready in the morning. Outside, winter holds the village in darkness. The road is empty. The fields are hidden beneath the night. Bare branches move gently in the wind. Somewhere beyond the houses, an animal shifts inside a shelter, and then becomes still again. Inside, the room is warmer than the world outside, but only just. People sleep close together. The fire gives enough light to see the outline of the room. A wooden bench. A basket. A low table. A hanging piece of cloth. A few tools resting against the wall. Nothing has changed. And perhaps that is part of the comfort of winter. The room remains familiar. The night passes slowly. Eventually, the embers become darker. A faint red glow remains beneath the ash. Then even that becomes difficult to see. The house becomes almost completely dark. Sleep comes. For a medieval household, night could be a long period of stillness, but it was not always completely unbroken. A person might wake because the room was cold. Someone might turn beneath a blanket. A child might stir. A roof might creak. Rain could strike the thatch. Wind could move around the walls. If the fire had nearly gone out, someone might wake and add another piece of wood. The darkness would briefly brighten. A face would appear. The room would glow. Then everyone would settle again. These small interruptions were part of sleeping through winter. There was no bright artificial light filling the room. Once the fire was low, darkness was almost complete. The eyes adjusted. Shapes became shadows. The house became quiet. And eventually morning came again. A pale line of light entered through the small opening in the wall. The person nearest the hearth woke first. The fire needed attention. The day began again. In this way, winter could create a rhythm that felt almost circular. Sleep. Fire. Food. Work. Darkness. Sleep. The same simple cycle returning each day. And although the medieval world contained castles, churches, markets, armies, kings, and distant cities, most people spent much of their winter life inside this smaller circle. The household. The village. The fields. The animals. The hearth. The season. A farmer might not know what was happening many miles away. A person in a small village could live for years without seeing a distant city. Their understanding of the world was shaped by what they could see and hear. The winter sky. The local church bell. The sound of a neighbor's cart. The arrival of a merchant. The weather. The condition of the fields. The health of the animals. These things mattered immediately. And winter made local life especially important. The roads were difficult. The daylight was limited. The fields were quiet. So people turned toward what was close. The village became the center of the winter world. There were neighbors to visit, goods to exchange, tools to repair, food to prepare, stories to share, and sometimes, simply people to sit beside. A winter afternoon could pass with very little movement. Imagine a small room in the middle of such an afternoon. The fire is burning steadily. A woman sits near it with wool in her lap. Her hands move slowly. Across the room, another person is repairing a wooden handle. A child sits on a low stool. The child watches the thread. Outside, rain falls. Not heavily. Just steadily. The roof makes a soft sound. The air inside smells of smoke and warm food. Someone coughs. Someone speaks quietly. Then the room becomes silent again. The wool continues moving through the fingers. The wooden handle continues taking shape. The fire continues burning. There is no need to fill every silence. Silence belongs naturally to winter. And for people accustomed to seasonal life, silence did not necessarily mean emptiness. It meant that the work was happening quietly. The body remained occupied. The mind could wander. Perhaps someone thought about the coming spring. Perhaps about a relative. Perhaps about the last harvest. Perhaps about a field that would need plowing. Winter offered time to think because the demands of the land were temporarily reduced. But the land was never completely forgotten. A farmer might look at the weather and think about what it meant for the coming year. Too much rain could be troublesome. Too much snow could delay work. A very cold winter could damage certain plants. A mild winter could bring different concerns. People watched the sky. They watched the ground. They watched the animals. They paid attention to signs because their lives depended upon the seasons. There were no exact guarantees. Spring would come, but the timing mattered. The harvest would come, but the size of it was uncertain. The household had to survive the distance between one harvest and the next. That was the deeper rhythm beneath the quiet winter days. Food had been gathered. Now it had to last. This is why the storage areas of medieval homes were so important. A cellar, where available, offered a cool and stable place for food. Root vegetables could be stored. Barrels could hold liquids. Jars could contain preserved foods. Grain could be kept dry. In some homes, storage pits or other arrangements were used. A person might enter the storage area and inspect what remained. A sack was opened. A handful of grain was examined. A basket was moved. An onion was selected. A piece of preserved food was taken. Every withdrawal reduced the store. The household knew this without needing to say it. Winter was a gradual movement through the year's supplies. The stores became smaller. The days became longer. Then spring would eventually arrive. But for now, there was still plenty of winter ahead. A person might spend part of the day preparing preserved foods. Salting and smoking were important methods of keeping meat and fish. Salt itself could be valuable. The amount used depended on what the household could afford. Fish could be dried or salted. Meat could be preserved. Cheese could be stored. Some fruits could be dried. These foods changed during storage. Their textures became different. Their flavors became stronger. But they could provide nourishment when fresh food was scarce. The smell of smoked meat could linger in a house. The scent of dried herbs could rise from a bundle near the fire. A wooden spoon could stir a pot containing beans and grain. The same foods might appear again tomorrow, and perhaps the day after that. Winter meals were often repetitive because repetition was practical. There was comfort in knowing what would be eaten. The household did not need to invent a new meal every evening. The ingredients were already there. The fire was already burning. The pot was already available. The recipe was known. Hands remembered what to do. A little grain. Some water. A few vegetables. Salt. Perhaps something preserved. Everything simmered together. The result was warm. That mattered. On a cold day, warmth itself became part of the meal. A bowl was held in both hands. Steam rose. The first spoonful was taken slowly. The heat spread through the body. The meal did not need to be elaborate. It needed to be enough. For people living through winter, enough was often a meaningful word. Enough food. Enough firewood. Enough clothing. Enough hay. Enough light. Enough strength. Enough time. The household was always balancing these things. A family with fewer resources had a narrower margin. If food stores ran low, winter could become frightening. If a person became sick, work could become difficult. If an animal died, the household could lose an important source of food, labor, or income. If a roof failed during heavy rain or snow, the home itself could become unsafe. So although our image of a quiet winter village may seem peaceful, the people living there could never completely forget practical concerns. They were peaceful moments within a life that required constant attention. The winter fire was comforting. But it also had to be fed. The warm meal was comforting. But the grain had to last. The thick blanket was comforting. But the wool had required work. The quiet house was comforting. But someone had to repair the roof. Everything depended on effort. And perhaps this made small comforts feel more meaningful. A warm room was valuable because warmth was not automatic. A full bowl mattered because food was not guaranteed. Dry clothing mattered because wet clothing could leave the body cold. A repaired shoe mattered because walking through winter mud in a damaged shoe was unpleasant and sometimes dangerous. Ordinary objects carried practical importance. A pair of good shoes might be carefully protected. A warm cloak might be kept for years. A wooden spoon could be used until it became smooth from countless meals. The winter months allowed people to care for these things. A leather worker might soften a piece of hide. A shoemaker could repair soles. A tailor could patch a cloak. A weaver could work at the loom. The sounds of these crafts filled indoor spaces. Thread pulled through cloth. Leather scraped. Wood shaved. Looms moved. Tools clicked. These were not loud sounds. They were steady sounds. Sounds that could continue for hours. A loom in particular could create a repetitive rhythm. The wooden frame stood in the workshop. Thread stretched across it. The shuttle moved. The threads shifted. The shuttle returned. Again. 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 The fabric slowly grew. A person could spend much of the winter working on cloth. The finished material might become clothing, household fabric, or something to sell. The work required attention, but once the rhythm was established, the hands could move almost automatically. Winter was well suited to such work. The outside world was cold. The workshop was enclosed. The hours were available. The craft could continue. In towns, this created a different kind of winter atmosphere. Instead of quiet farmhouses scattered across fields, there were narrow streets filled with workshops. A person might walk through the town and hear many different sounds. A hammer striking metal. A saw moving through wood. A loom working behind a doorway. A wheel turning. Voices inside shops. Animals moving through muddy streets. The smell of bread. Smoke from fires. Wet earth. Leather. Wood. Even in winter, towns remained busy. But the pace was slower. People wrapped themselves in cloaks. Hoods were pulled close. Hands were protected as best as possible. Mud clung to shoes. Water froze in places. The market stalls were more subdued than in summer. Still, people came. A person needed salt. Another needed grain. Someone needed cloth. Someone wanted tools repaired. Someone brought eggs. Someone carried cheese. Someone sold firewood. The market connected the village and the town. And winter made these connections especially important because people depended upon stored goods and trade. A merchant arriving with a wagon could bring something that a village could not easily produce itself. Salt was particularly important. Iron was important. Cloth was important. Certain foods came from distant places. The arrival of a merchant could therefore be useful. But the merchant also had to travel through the same difficult winter roads. A wagon moved slowly. Wheels sank into mud. Horses tired. Rain fell. Snow gathered. The journey required patience. A person traveling in winter might stop at an inn or a monastery. Inside, there would be a fire. Wet clothing could be hung near it. A warm meal might be served. The traveler could rest. Outside, the road could wait until morning. For most ordinary villagers, though, long journeys were uncommon. Home remained the safest familiar place. The hearth remained the center. And winter encouraged people to stay close. Even children spent much of the season indoors. Their world was smaller. They might help with simple household tasks. They could carry small objects. Gather kindling. Watch animals. Help prepare food. Learn spinning or sewing. Learn how tools were handled. They learned by being present. A child sitting beside an adult while work was being done was already learning. The child saw how bread was made. How wool was spun. How a fire was maintained. How a tool was repaired. How food was stored. How animals were treated. The lessons of winter were practical. They were not separated from life. They were life. And so the long winter day continued. The morning had become afternoon. The afternoon had become evening. Outside, the sky was already dark. Inside, the fire was bright again. Someone stirred the pot. Someone closed the shutters. Someone checked the animals. The house settled into another night. The same rhythm. The same warmth. The same small sounds. And yet, within this repetition, there were occasional changes. A church bell might ring. A messenger might arrive. A neighbor might visit. A traveler might stop. A birth might take place. A funeral might be held. A market day might come. A feast day might bring a different meal. Winter was repetitive, but it was not completely unchanging. Religious life also shaped the winter calendar. Churches and monasteries marked holy days and seasons. People attended services when they could. Church bells provided sounds that traveled across villages and towns. In the quiet winter air, a bell could carry surprisingly far. A single note might pass over roofs and fields. It could be heard by people working inside their homes. They knew what it meant. Time was being marked. A service was beginning. A day of importance had arrived. The church itself could be cold. Stone walls held the winter chill. People entered wearing cloaks. Their footsteps echoed. Candles provided small points of light. The air smelled of wax, stone, and perhaps smoke. People stood together. The service passed slowly. Then they returned outside. The cold air met them again. They walked home. The winter day continued. Religious festivals could interrupt the ordinary routine. There might be special foods, different clothing, gatherings, travel to nearby villages. But once the special day passed, ordinary life returned. The fire needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Food needed preparing. Clothing needed repairing. The winter season continued. There was another quiet aspect of winter life that is easy to overlook. Cleaning. A household had to remain reasonably clean even when washing was difficult. Floors could be swept. Ash could be removed. Bedding could be aired when weather allowed. Clothing could be beaten or brushed. Cooking vessels had to be cleaned. Waste had to be managed. The work was not glamorous. It simply had to be done. A broom moved across the floor. Dust rose. Straw shifted. A hand gathered debris. The room became cleaner. Then the fire was tended again. A medieval home was a working place. There was always something that needed attention. Even a quiet afternoon could contain several small tasks. A person might begin with sewing, then move to cooking, then feed an animal, then return to sewing, then bring in wood, then stir the pot. The day was divided naturally. There were no sharp boundaries between work and home. Home was work. Work was home. Winter simply brought more of it indoors. For people living in larger households, servants might share many of these tasks. A servant could rise early to prepare the fire. Another might carry water. Someone might clean. Someone might prepare food. Another could work with animals. In a manor household, there could be many people moving through the rooms. Yet the same winter needs remained. Fire, food, water, clothing, animals, storage. The wealthy could have more resources. The poor had fewer. But winter remained a season of careful management for everyone. Even a large manor had to keep its stores organized. Grain had to be protected. Meat had to be preserved. Wine or ale had to be stored. Firewood had to be available. Animals had to be fed. The kitchen remained active. In a larger kitchen, several people might work together. Large pots hung over the fire. Bread was prepared in quantity. Vegetables were cleaned. Meat was cut. Dishes were washed. Steam and smoke filled the air. The kitchen could be one of the warmest places in the household. People working there might remain near the fire for much of the day. Outside the kitchen, the rest of the manor could feel colder. Stone walls were especially slow to warm. Wooden rooms held warmth differently. A person might move between spaces according to the temperature. The winter day was felt through the body. Cold hands. Cold feet. Warm face near the fire. Chilled back when turning away. People learned to manage these sensations. They moved closer. They wrapped themselves in cloth. They added wood. They closed shutters. They drank warm food. They waited. Waiting was part of winter. Waiting for bread to bake. Waiting for water to heat. Waiting for snow to melt. Waiting for a traveler. Waiting for the weather to improve. Waiting for spring. There was a special kind of patience in that waiting. The future could not be hurried. The fields would not be ready because someone wanted them to be. The snow would melt when it melted. The daylight would lengthen slowly. The season would turn when the season turned. And so people lived inside the time that was given to them. One winter day. Then another. Then another. Perhaps the first snow had seemed beautiful. After many weeks, it was simply part of the landscape. The cold became familiar. The darkness became familiar. The early evenings became familiar. The fire became familiar. The household adjusted. And slowly, the middle of winter could pass almost unnoticed. The days were still short. The nights still long. The same paths were walked. The same food was eaten. The same work was done. But beneath the quiet earth, the season was already moving. The sun was slowly changing its path. The daylight would eventually return for longer hours. People might not notice it immediately. One evening, the light would remain a little longer. Another morning, dawn would arrive slightly earlier. The difference would be small. Almost invisible. Yet winter was never truly still. The world was moving. The trees were waiting. The seeds were resting. The animals were surviving. The people were preparing. And inside the warm darkness of the medieval house, another winter evening was beginning. The fire had been fed. The bread had been broken. The wool had been gathered. The tools had been put away. A child had fallen asleep near the hearth. Someone quietly lifted the child and carried them to the sleeping place. The blanket was pulled gently over the small body. The room became still. Outside, the wind moved across the fields. Inside, the fire gave one last warm glow. And the long winter night settled once more over the village, while the people slept close to one another, waiting patiently for another quiet morning. The night passes quietly over the village. The wind moves across the fields, touching the bare branches and the roofs of the houses. Somewhere beyond the last cottage, a stream moves beneath a thin layer of ice. The water still travels beneath the cold surface, making a sound that can hardly be heard from the village. Inside the houses, people sleep. The hearths are low. The rooms are dark. The winter air presses gently against the walls. Then, slowly, morning returns. It begins as a change in the darkness. The room is no longer completely black. There is a faint grayness near the small window. Someone wakes. For a moment, there is no movement. Then the blanket is pushed aside. Feet touch the cold floor. A hand reaches toward the hearth. The ashes are stirred. The embers are found. Another winter morning begins. There is something almost timeless about this moment. The same fire has been made countless times before. The same hands have performed the same movement. The same room has watched morning arrive through hundreds of seasons. Winter does not ask for novelty. It asks for patience. And patience is built into the smallest parts of the day. A person carries water. Someone feeds the animals. Another person prepares food. Someone opens the door and feels the cold. Then the door closes again. The morning continues. In some villages, the winter sky is clear. The ground is hard with frost. The roofs are pale. The fields stretch out beneath a thin silver light. In other places, rain has fallen through the night. The paths are dark and wet. Mud clings to shoes. The grass is flattened. Water gathers in small hollows. Winter did not look the same everywhere. Some people lived beneath heavy snow. Others knew long weeks of cold rain. Some regions had bright, dry winter days. Others were covered in mist. But the basic rhythm remained. Stay warm. Protect the food. Care for the animals. Repair what is broken. Wait for the fields to become ready again. For a farmer, the winter fields could almost seem like another world. During the growing season, they had been full of movement. People had walked between the rows. Animals had grazed. Crops had grown. Tools had passed through the soil. Harvesters had bent over the plants. Wagons had crossed the fields. Now the same land was quiet. The soil had been turned. The stubble remained. The empty field stretched beneath the winter sky. A farmer might walk through it occasionally, checking boundaries or looking at the condition of the ground. A fence might have fallen. A ditch might need clearing. A gate might have broken. Even the resting land needed attention. The farmer might stop beside a field and look toward the distant trees. There was little to see. But he knew what would eventually happen. The soil would warm. The days would lengthen. The plow would return. Seeds would be placed into the earth. Green would appear. For now, the field was resting. And the farmer could return home. The road beneath his feet might be muddy. His cloak might gather moisture. His hands might be cold. He would open the door. Warm air would meet him. Smoke would drift toward the ceiling. Someone would be preparing food. The ordinary world would close around him again. This was the pattern of many winter journeys. Out briefly. Back inside. The house became a refuge from the season. But not every winter day could be spent entirely at home. There were tasks that required people to go outside. Firewood had to be gathered. Water had to be carried. Animals had to be moved. Fences had to be checked. Fields had to be inspected. Goods had to be transported. A person might spend an hour outdoors and then return to the hearth with cold hands and damp clothing. The first thing to do was often to get warm. A cloak was removed. Wet shoes were placed near the fire. Hands were held close to the flames. A bowl of warm food was prepared. The body slowly recovered from the cold. The winter house was full of such small recoveries. Cold to warm. Hungry to fed. Tired to rested. Wet to dry. Each transition was noticeable because winter made the difference stronger. A warm fire was precious when the air outside was freezing. Dry straw was precious when the road was wet. A thick wool blanket was precious when the room was cold. A bowl of hot porridge was precious when the morning had begun beneath frost. Comfort did not need to be elaborate. It could be very small. Sometimes it was simply sitting down. A person who had been standing for hours could lower themselves onto a bench near the fire. The shoulders relaxed. The hands rested. The warmth slowly reached the fingers. For a few moments, nothing else needed to happen. Then the next task would begin. This mixture of work and rest shaped winter life. People did not necessarily spend the season in complete leisure. Instead, they worked at a slower rhythm. There was more room for tasks that could wait. A basket might be repaired. A wooden spoon might be carved. A coat might be patched. A rope might be twisted. A tool might be sharpened. A wall might be strengthened. A small leak might be repaired before it became a larger problem. Winter gave people a chance to care for the things that summer had left worn and tired. The tools had worked hard during harvest. The animals had worked hard pulling carts and plows. The clothing had been exposed to rain, dust, sweat, and sun. The household itself had been busy. Now there was time to restore what could be restored. A farmer could sit with a damaged tool across his knees. He would examine the wood. Perhaps the handle had become loose. He would remove it. A new piece of wood might be shaped. The knife would scrape the surface. Small curls would fall onto the floor. He would test the fit. Adjust it. Test it again. Eventually, the tool would be ready. Nothing about the work was dramatic. Yet the tool might be used for another year. Perhaps for many years. A well-maintained tool was part of the household's security. And so the winter afternoon continued. The fire burned. The knife moved. The wood became smooth. Outside, clouds crossed the sky. There was no hurry. Another person might be preparing thread. A child might be learning how to hold the spindle. The adult's hands moved slowly. The child watched. The spindle turned too quickly at first. The thread became uneven. The adult corrected the movement. Again. Slowly. The child tried again. Winter was full of these quiet lessons. Not every lesson had a name. Children learned simply by being present. They learned how to carry a cup without spilling it. How to hold a broom. How to gather kindling. How to help with animals. How to recognize different tools. How to prepare simple food. How to sit quietly while adults worked. To remain especially slow to warm. Had grown. Tools had passed through the soil. Harvesters had bent over the plants. Wagons had crossed the fields. Now the same land was quiet. The soil had been turned. The stubble remained. The empty field stretched beneath the winter sky. A farmer might walk through it occasionally, checking boundaries or looking at the condition of the ground. A fence might have fallen. A ditch might need clearing. A gate might have broken. Even the resting land needed attention. The farmer might stop beside a field and look toward the distant trees. There was little to see. But he knew what would eventually happen. The soil would warm. The days would lengthen. The plow would return. Seeds would be placed into the earth. Green would appear. For now, the field was resting. And the farmer could return home. The road beneath his feet might be muddy. His cloak might gather moisture. His hands might be cold. He would open the door. Warm air would meet him. Smoke would drift toward the ceiling. Someone would be preparing food. The ordinary world would close around him again. This was the pattern of many winter journeys. Out briefly. Back inside. The house became a refuge from the season. But not every winter day could be spent entirely at home. There were tasks that required people to go outside. Firewood had to be gathered. Water had to be carried. Animals had to be moved. Fences had to be checked. Fields had to be inspected. Goods had to be transported. A person might spend an hour outdoors and then return to the hearth with cold hands and damp clothing. The first thing to do was often to get warm. A cloak was removed. Wet shoes were placed near the fire. Hands were held close to the flames. A bowl of warm food was prepared. The body slowly recovered from the cold. The winter house was full of such small recoveries. Cold to warm. Hungry to fed. Tired to rested. Wet to dry. Each transition was noticeable because winter made the difference stronger. A warm fire was precious when the air outside was freezing. Dry straw was precious when the road was wet. A thick wool blanket was precious when the room was cold. A bowl of hot porridge was precious when the morning had begun beneath frost. Comfort did not need to be elaborate. It could be very small. Sometimes it was simply sitting down. A person who had been standing for hours could lower themselves onto a bench near the fire. The shoulders relaxed. The hands rested. The warmth slowly reached the fingers. For a few moments, nothing else needed to happen. Then the next task would begin. This mixture of work and rest shaped winter life. People did not necessarily spend the season in complete leisure. Instead, they worked at a slower rhythm. There was more room for tasks that could wait. A basket might be repaired. A wooden spoon might be carved. A coat might be patched. A rope might be twisted. A tool might be sharpened. A wall might be strengthened. A small leak might be repaired before it became a larger problem. Winter gave people a chance to care for the things that summer had left worn and tired. The tools had worked hard during harvest. The animals had worked hard pulling carts and plows. The clothing had been exposed to rain, dust, sweat, and sun. The household itself had been busy. Now there was time to restore what could be restored. A farmer could sit with the damaged tool across his knees. He would examine the wood. Perhaps the handle had become loose. He would remove it. A new piece of wood might be shaped. The knife would scrape the surface. Small curls would fall onto the floor. He would test the fit. Adjust it. Test it again. Eventually, the tool would be ready. Nothing about the work was dramatic. Yet the tool might be used for another year. Perhaps for many years. A well-maintained tool was part of the household's security. And so the winter afternoon continued. The fire burned. The knife moved. The wood became smooth. Outside, clouds crossed the sky. There was no hurry. Another person might be preparing thread. A child might be learning how to hold the spindle. The adult's hands moved slowly. The child watched. The spindle turned too quickly at first. The thread became uneven. The adult corrected the movement. Again. Slowly. The child tried again. Winter was full of these quiet lessons. Not every lesson had a name. Children learned simply by being present. They learned how to carry a cup without spilling it. How to hold a broom. How to gather kindling. How to help with animals. How to recognize different tools. How to prepare simple food. How to sit quietly while adults worked. They learned the sounds of the household. The sound of bread being kneaded. The sound of wood splitting. The sound of a door opening. The sound of the church bell. The sound of rain. The sound of the animals in the barn. These sounds became part of memory. A medieval childhood was surrounded by practical knowledge. Winter provided many opportunities to absorb it. In the evening, when the work became lighter, people might talk. A neighbor could arrive at the door. Cold air would enter. The visitor would stamp mud or snow from their shoes. A cloak would be loosened. A place near the hearth would be offered. There might be news from another household. Perhaps a family member had become ill. Perhaps someone was expecting a child. Perhaps a traveler had arrived in the nearby town. Perhaps a roof had been damaged by wind. Perhaps the river had frozen. These small pieces of information traveled from house to house. In a world without rapid communication, people learned about the wider community through conversation. A winter evening could therefore become a quiet exchange of news. Two people sitting near a fire. A pot simmering. Hands resting. Voices low. The visitor eventually stood. The cloak was tightened. The door opened. Cold air entered once more. Then the visitor disappeared into the darkness. The door closed. The room became warm again. Such visits were simple. But they connected people. Winter could be isolating, especially when weather made travel difficult. A familiar voice at the door could break the long stillness. In some places, people gathered in larger communal spaces. A church. An inn. A workshop. A manor hall. These gatherings were not always frequent, but they offered moments when people could see others beyond their own household. The winter season could therefore move between solitude and community. Quiet hours at home. Then a market day. A visit. A religious service. A communal task. Then back to the small house. The contrast made the quiet feel deeper. After a busy market, the silence of home could seem especially strong. After several days indoors, a walk through the village could feel different. The air would be cold. The path familiar. The houses close. Smoke rising. Someone splitting wood. Someone carrying water. The church bell sounding in the distance. Then the person would return home. The door would close. The fire would glow. The winter world would become small again. For some people, winter also meant making plans. A merchant might calculate what goods were available. A farmer might consider the coming planting season. A craftsperson might think about orders. A household might decide how much food remained. These thoughts did not necessarily become formal plans written on paper. Often they were simply spoken. We need more grain. The roof should be repaired. The horse needs new harness. The fence near the field is broken. More wood should be brought inside. The future was present in these small statements. Winter was a bridge between one agricultural year and the next. People were living from the past harvest while preparing for the future harvest. The grain in the storehouse belonged to the previous season. The repaired plow belonged to the coming season. The wool being spun now might become clothing used later. The seeds being protected would eventually return to the soil. Everything connected. The medieval year was a continuous movement of preparation and use. Winter was simply the quieter portion of that cycle. There was also time for cleaning and sorting. A storage room could be inspected. Old straw might be removed. Containers could be checked. Grain could be protected from moisture. Cloth could be folded. Tools could be arranged. A household with very little space still had to find places for everything. The smallest homes could become crowded during winter. People. Animals. Food. Fuel. Tools. Clothing. All needed space. The hearth gave warmth, but it also created smoke. The floor could become dirty. The walls could become darkened. The air could become heavy. People opened doors when they could to let fresh air enter. But opening a door also let cold air inside. So there was always a balance. Fresh air or warmth. Light or heat. Firewood or darkness. Winter forced people to make these small choices repeatedly. A person might sit beside a smoky fire, eyes watering slightly, because the warmth was worth it. They knew how to live with the limitations of the house. The same was true of lighting. When daylight disappeared, work became harder. A candle could help, but candles required materials. Wax candles could be expensive. Tallow candles were more common for many households and could produce an unpleasant smell and smoke. So people often arranged their tasks around the available daylight. The brightest hours were useful for detailed work. The darker hours were suited to simpler tasks. A person could prepare food by firelight. They could talk. They could spin. They could repair something familiar. But reading or detailed writing required better light. This meant that the winter day had natural boundaries. Morning light arrived. Work began. The middle of the day provided the best light. Afternoon faded. Evening came. Then the household slowed. The darkness itself became part of the daily schedule. For a scribe, this was especially important. Writing required concentration. The parchment or paper had to be visible. The ink had to be controlled. The letters had to be formed carefully. In a monastery or wealthy household, a scribe could work in a room arranged for this purpose. The desk might be near a window. During winter, daylight was limited. The scribe worked while the light lasted. The quill moved. Ink dried. A page filled slowly. There was no reason to hurry. A manuscript could take months or years to complete. Winter simply became another period of careful work. The same page might occupy an afternoon. The same passage might be copied again and again. The quiet room would be filled with the faint sound of writing. Outside, the cold world remained distant. The scribe might pause to warm their fingers. Then return to the page. In monasteries, winter also brought long periods of quiet reading and prayer. Stone buildings could be very cold. Candles burned in dark interiors. The sound of footsteps traveled along corridors. The walls were thick. The outside world seemed far away. A monk might spend part of the day reading. Another might work in the kitchen. Another might care for animals. Another might repair clothing. Another might tend to the fire. Even within religious communities, winter was filled with practical work. People still needed food. Buildings still needed care. Animals still needed attention. The spiritual rhythm of the monastery existed alongside ordinary physical needs. The same was true everywhere. Human bodies still needed warmth. Food still needed cooking. Clothing still needed repair. Winter was a physical season. People felt it on their skin. They felt it in their hands. They felt it in their feet. They felt it in their backs after carrying wood. They felt it in the stiffness of early mornings. They felt relief when sitting beside a fire. The body knew winter intimately. This is one reason that rest mattered. After working outside, a person might sit near the fire without speaking. The muscles slowly relaxed. Hands were held toward the warmth. A bowl was held close. The room was quiet. The person looked at the flames. The fire moved. A log cracked. A small spark rose. Then disappeared. For a while, there was nothing else to do. This kind of rest was not unusual. It was part of the daily rhythm. Work had its place. Rest had its place. Neither needed to be dramatic. The body worked until it was tired. Then it rested. The next morning, it worked again. For people who lived by physical labor, this cycle was unavoidable. Farmers, builders, woodcutters, fishermen, carpenters, smiths, weavers, servants, porters, masons. Their winter work differed, but their bodies experienced the season in similar ways. Cold, damp, fatigue, warmth, rest. For fishermen living near rivers, lakes, or coasts, winter brought another set of routines. The water could become dangerous. Fishing might be reduced in some places. Boats needed care. Nets needed repair. Lines needed attention. A fisherman might sit indoors working on a torn net while listening to the wind outside. The net lay across his knees. He examined the broken section. The cord was threaded through, one loop at a time. The repair continued. It could take hours. The work was quiet. The smell of rope and damp wood filled the room. A boat might be pulled farther onto shore during rough weather. Wood could be repaired. Planks could be checked. Oars could be shaped. Winter provided time to prepare for the return of easier fishing conditions. Near rivers, the winter landscape could be particularly quiet. The water moved slowly. Mist hovered above it. Reeds stood brown and still. The banks were empty. A fisherman might stand for a moment looking across the water, then turn toward home. The path beneath his feet was wet. His hands were cold. The fire would be waiting. The world seemed reduced to a few simple elements: water, earth, wood, smoke, fire, breath. Winter. For travelers and merchants, inns provided another kind of winter shelter. An inn might have a large common room with a central fire. Travelers arrived with wet cloaks. Boots were removed. People gathered near the warmth. Food was served. Ale or another drink might be poured. The room could be more crowded than a village home. Voices overlapped. Animals might be kept nearby. Someone might be sleeping on a bench. Someone might be preparing for the next day's journey. Outside, snow or rain continued. Inside, the fire burned. The traveler could rest. Perhaps the road had been difficult. Perhaps the journey had taken longer than expected. The inn became a temporary home. A place to wait. A place to dry clothing. A place to eat. A place to sleep. Then, in the morning, the journey continued. The winter world was always asking people to slow down. Roads. Weather. Darkness. Cold. All encouraged caution. Even horses moved differently on icy paths. Carts moved slowly. People walked carefully. A traveler could not simply assume that the road would be clear. Every mile required attention. For most ordinary villagers, this reinforced the importance of staying nearby. The home was known. The road was uncertain. The hearth was warm. The outside world was cold. So people remained close whenever possible. And as the weeks passed, the household settled more deeply into its winter rhythm. The same morning. The same fire. The same food. The same tasks. The same evening. Yet there was a quiet beauty in this repetition. A person could become deeply familiar with the smallest details. They knew how the fire sounded when the wood was dry. They knew which corner of the house was warmest. They knew how long the bread needed to bake. They knew how much grain remained. They knew which blanket was thickest. They knew where the tools were stored. They knew which roof beam creaked when the wind blew. Winter turned a house into a small world of familiar sounds and objects. And perhaps, after many weeks, a person could move through that world almost without thinking. The hand found the bowl. The foot found the step. The knife found the wood. The spindle found its rhythm. The fire found its warmth. Outside, the season continued. Inside, life continued too. Slowly. Quietly. One day flowing into another. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the sleeping village, the first faint signs of the changing year were beginning. The days were still cold. The fields were still bare. The trees were still quiet. But the darkness would not last forever. For now, though, there was still another long winter evening ahead. The fire was burning. The household was gathered. A piece of wool rested beside the hearth. A wooden tool lay across a bench. A pot was warming slowly. The wind moved around the walls. And the people inside settled into the familiar warmth, allowing the long day to become quiet again. The winter night had returned. And in the small circle of firelight, there was still work to finish, food to prepare, stories to remember, and another peaceful stretch of darkness before morning. The winter evening grows deeper, but the household does not become completely still. There are always a few small things left to do. A piece of cloth is folded. A wooden bowl is moved closer to the wall. A little food is covered and set aside. The fire is adjusted. Someone checks the door. Someone listens to the animals outside. Then, slowly, the room begins to settle. The fire has become the brightest thing in the house. Its light reaches only a short distance. Beyond it, the corners remain dark. The wooden beams overhead disappear into shadow. The faces of the people nearby appear softly, then fade again as the flames move. This is how many winter evenings would have looked. Not bright. Not completely dark. A small island of warmth surrounded by night. And beyond the walls, the winter landscape is almost silent. The fields are resting. The roads are empty. The trees stand bare. A little snow may be falling. Or rain may be touching the roof. The night does not need to announce itself. It simply remains. Inside, someone begins to tell a story. It may be a story that has been told many times. Perhaps everyone already knows what will happen. There is no need for surprise. The familiar words are part of the comfort. A person listens while continuing to work. The spindle turns. The thread grows. A child watches the fire. An older person sits quietly with hands folded beneath a blanket. The story moves slowly through the room. Outside, the wind passes over the fields. The fire makes a small sound. The room remains warm. Winter evenings offered time for these moments because there was little reason to be elsewhere. In summer, the evening could be filled with outdoor work. There were animals to move. Crops to tend. Fields to inspect. Food to preserve. Long daylight encouraged activity. But winter was different. Darkness came early. The body naturally slowed. People remained indoors. And when the practical work was finished, there could be time for conversation. There could also be time for silence. The two belong together. Someone might speak for a while. Then no one would speak. The fire would continue. A log would shift. A child might yawn. Someone would add another piece of wood. The conversation would begin again. There was no need to fill every moment. A winter evening could breathe. And perhaps this was one of the reasons the season felt so long. The hours were not divided by many changes. They stretched gently from one task to another. After supper came repair work. After repair came conversation. After conversation came quiet. After quiet came sleep. The same sequence could repeat many times. But repetition was not necessarily boring to the people living it. It was simply life. The same paths were walked because they were the paths that connected the house to the well, the barn, the fields, and the neighboring homes. The same food was eaten because it was what had been stored. The same tools were used because they were useful. The same fire was tended because warmth was necessary. The same people sat together because family and household were close. The winter world was built from familiar things. And in a familiar world, small changes could become important. A new piece of clothing. A repaired chair. A different kind of bread. A visitor from another village. A clear day after many days of rain. A little more sunlight. A new animal born in the barn. Even the smallest change could be noticed. The arrival of a new calf, for example, could interrupt an ordinary winter morning. The animal would need care. The household might watch carefully. Someone would bring straw. Someone would make sure the mother was comfortable. The event would become part of the winter story. Weeks later, people might still remember the cold morning when the animal was born. In this way, memory was created through ordinary life. Not every important moment belonged to kings or battles. Many memories came from kitchens, barns, fields, workshops, and winter fires. A person might remember the smell of bread, the sound of rain, the first snow, the day a roof was repaired, the evening a relative arrived, the morning an animal was born, the winter when the food was plentiful, the winter when the food was not. These were the details that filled a lifetime. And while the household rested, the wider medieval world continued beyond the village. Kings made decisions. Lords managed estates. Merchants moved goods. Church leaders wrote letters. Armies sometimes traveled. Ships crossed seas. But for the ordinary family sitting beside the hearth, those distant events might feel very far away. Their immediate world was smaller. The weather mattered more. The harvest mattered more. The health of the animals mattered more. The amount of grain in the storehouse mattered more. Winter narrowed attention toward what was close. A person could look through a small opening in the wall and see only darkness. The distant world disappeared. The nearby world became everything. The next morning, the household would wake again. Perhaps the weather would have changed. If snow had fallen during the night, the first person outside would find the village transformed. The paths would be covered. The roofs would be white. The fences would carry small ridges of snow. Footprints would be fresh. The air would be still. A person might stand in the doorway for a moment. The cold would enter the house. The white landscape would seem strangely bright in the early morning. Then the person would step outside. The snow would compress beneath their feet. The sound would be soft. They would walk toward the barn. The animals would be waiting. The work would continue. Even a beautiful winter morning required practical attention. Snow had to be cleared from entrances. Animals had to be fed. Water might need to be broken free of ice. Wood had to be carried. The beauty of winter never removed the work of winter. A wooden stick could be used to break a thin layer of ice on a water container. The surface would crack. The person would remove the pieces. The water beneath would be dark and cold. The animal would drink. Then the person would return inside. Their fingers would be numb. They would hold them close to the fire. The morning meal would be waiting. Warm food. Warm hands. A quiet room. The snow would continue falling outside. For some families, snow could make the day even more inward. Travel became difficult. Fields disappeared. The roads were nearly empty. The house became the center of the day. There might be little reason to go farther than the barn. This created long stretches of indoor work. A person might spend several hours weaving. Another might repair clothing. Someone might prepare food. A child might help sort beans or grain. Someone else might sharpen tools. The room would remain busy, but quietly so. A winter workshop could be almost meditative. The work had rhythm. A loom moved back and forth. A spindle turned. A knife scraped wood. A needle passed through cloth. The sounds repeated. The hands learned. The day moved. This was the kind of work that could occupy a person's attention without demanding constant thought. The mind could drift. Perhaps toward memories. Perhaps toward the weather. Perhaps toward the coming spring. Perhaps toward the simple question of what would be eaten that evening. The body remained busy while the mind became quiet. And sometimes that quiet was welcome. Medieval life could be physically demanding. There was little separation between survival and labor. Food had to be produced. Shelter had to be maintained. Clothing had to be made. Fuel had to be gathered. Animals had to be cared for. So winter's slower rhythm could provide a small breathing space. Not a complete rest, but a change. The heaviest agricultural work was temporarily reduced. The fields waited. The household turned inward. The hands continued working. And the long winter hours passed. In some regions, winter was also a time when people slaughtered animals that had been prepared for this purpose. Meat could then be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. This was practical seasonal work. A household could not keep every animal through the cold months because each animal required feed. So the number of animals kept alive had to be managed. The preserved meat then became part of the winter food supply. Smoke filled the air during preservation. The smell could linger in the household. Salt was rubbed into meat. Pieces were hung. The process took time. Once prepared, the food could remain stored. A little could be taken when needed. Again, winter was a season of using what had been prepared earlier. There was a quiet logic to it. Autumn had gathered. Winter consumed. Spring would begin again. Nothing happened alone. Every season depended on the previous one. A loaf eaten beside the fire in January began as grain in a field many months before. A wool blanket used on a cold night began with sheep grazing during warmer weather. A wooden chair beside the hearth began as a tree in the forest. The winter household was surrounded by the work of the entire year. The people inside might not think about all these connections consciously. They simply lived among them. The blanket was warm. The bread was ready. The fire burned. That was enough. There were also quieter winter tasks that required patience rather than strength. Making cord. Preparing flax. Sorting fibers. Repairing nets. Cleaning grain. Removing damaged seeds. Preparing household materials. These tasks could take hours. A person might sit near the doorway during the brighter part of the day. The cold air would remain outside. The work would be spread across a low table. Hands would separate one thing from another. Good grain from damaged grain. Useful fibers from waste. Strong thread from weak thread. It was slow work. But slow work was everywhere. The medieval household was filled with processes that could not be rushed. Food needed time to cook. Cloth needed time to weave. Wood needed time to season. Leather needed time to dry. Bread needed time to rise. People needed time to learn. Winter seemed to fit naturally into this world. The season itself was slow. It did not hurry towards spring. It simply moved. Day after day. Night after night. And perhaps the people living through it learned to accept this rhythm. There was no need to make every day exciting. A day could simply be useful. A person could complete the tasks required of them. Then rest. This was enough. For children, the winter days could sometimes feel longer. There were fewer opportunities to run through fields. Mud and snow limited outdoor play. The cold made the house more important. Children could watch adults work. They might make small objects from scraps of wood. They might play with simple household items. They might listen to stories. They might sit near the hearth. They learned patience because there was little else to do. The house was their world. The village was just beyond the door. The winter landscape was something to observe from the threshold. Perhaps a child would watch snow falling. Perhaps they would press a hand against the cold wall. Perhaps they would listen to the sound of the wind. Then an adult would call them back toward the fire. The child would return. The winter day continued. In larger homes, children might have more space. In wealthy households, there could be servants, tutors, and private rooms. But the seasons still shaped their routines. They learned according to the customs of their household. A young noble might learn reading, writing, religion, riding, household management, or other skills. A child in a farming family learned farming. A child in a craft household learned the craft. The path of a person's life was often closely connected to the household into which they were born. Winter was one of the times when these skills were passed along. An older craftsperson had more time to teach. A parent had more time to demonstrate. An apprentice had more time to practice. The work continued from one generation to the next. And this was how many skills survived. Not through books alone. Through hands. A father showing a son how to repair a tool. A mother showing a daughter how to prepare thread. A master showing an apprentice how to shape wood. An older farmer showing a younger person how to judge a piece of land. Knowledge moved quietly. It lived inside routine. The winter workshop was therefore also a place where the past was carried forward. The tools might look worn. The techniques might be old. The movements might have been repeated by countless hands before. The apprentice simply learned them. And eventually, those hands would teach someone else. The winter evening returns again. The household has eaten. The work has slowed. Someone is mending a final piece of cloth. A needle catches the firelight. The thread disappears into the fabric. The repair is almost finished. The person pauses. They look at the work. The cloth is folded. Set aside. Another task completed. There is a gentle satisfaction in finishing something small. The household does not need to celebrate it. The repaired cloth will simply be worn again. The tool will simply be used again. The bread will simply be eaten. The fire will simply warm the room. Life continues. Outside, the moon may appear through gaps in the clouds. Its light falls across the snow. Or perhaps there is no moon at all. Only darkness. The village sleeps. The church tower stands above the roofs. The fields lie empty. A few animals move in their shelters. The cold settles deeper into the ground. Inside, the fire burns lower. Someone reaches for another log. It is placed carefully on the embers. A small flame rises. The wood catches. Warmth returns. The people remain close. Perhaps one person is still awake. They sit quietly beside the hearth. There is nothing urgent. The room is familiar. The day is finished. The person looks into the fire. The flames move slowly. A log collapses inward. Ash shifts. A few sparks rise. Then disappear. This simple scene could have happened countless times in medieval homes. A person sitting quietly near the fire at the end of a long winter day. No audience. No record. No great event. Just a tired person enjoying the warmth before sleep. These moments are easy to overlook when thinking about history. But most of history was made from such moments. People woke. People ate. People worked. People rested. People became tired. People cared for children. People cared for animals. People repaired things. People waited for morning. And the winter season gave these ordinary actions a particular atmosphere. The cold outside. The warmth inside. The long darkness. The early sunset. The smell of wood smoke. The soft sound of rain. The pale light through a small window. The rough texture of wool. The warmth of bread. The quiet weight of a blanket. These details were part of everyday life. A person might wake in the night and hear the rain. They might pull the blanket closer. The house would be quiet. The fire would be low. They would listen. Then return to sleep. Morning would eventually come. There was no need to know the exact hour. The changing light would tell them. Winter made people attentive to natural time. Dawn. Midday. Dusk. Night. The sun was the great clock. The church bells helped mark the hours. But the body also knew. Hunger came near meal times. Tiredness came after work. Sleep came when darkness had lasted long enough. People lived within these rhythms. The winter day could therefore feel very different from the long summer day. There were fewer hours of light for outdoor work. People adjusted. The workday became shaped by the season. A farmer might spend fewer hours in the field and more hours maintaining tools. A shepherd might spend more time sheltering animals. A craftsperson might work longer indoors. A household might devote more time to spinning, weaving, sewing, carving, and food preparation. The same people who worked outside during the warm months now worked closer to the hearth. Winter did not remove labor. It changed its location. The field became the workshop. The barn became important. The kitchen became busier. The hearth became the center. The village became quieter. The road became less important. The home became the main stage of daily life. And so, as another winter day comes toward its end, the same small world begins to close around the household. The last light has disappeared. The fire has been fed. The animals are settled. The door is shut. The food is stored. The tools are resting. The wool is folded. The children are sleeping. The adults are growing quiet. A final piece of wood is placed on the fire. It burns slowly. The room glows. The walls hold the warmth. Outside, the cold remains. But inside, for a little while, there is enough. Enough heat. Enough food. Enough shelter. Enough quiet. The long winter day has passed. And another will come. Morning will bring the same pale light. The same cold floor. The same fire. The same familiar tasks. Yet somewhere beneath the repetition, the season is changing by degrees. The sun is slowly returning. The days will eventually become longer. The snow will eventually soften. The roads will eventually dry. The fields will eventually open again. But tonight, none of that needs to happen. Tonight is still winter. The people inside do not need to hurry towards spring. They can simply rest. The fire makes a quiet sound. The wind moves along the roof. A wooden beam creaks. Someone turns beneath a blanket. The room becomes darker. The last visible flame bends low, then rises again. For a few moments, the hearth remains bright. Then the household settles deeper into sleep. And outside, the medieval village lies beneath the winter sky, its empty fields waiting patiently beyond the dark houses, while another long night passes slowly over the roofs. The winter night has settled completely now. The village is quiet. The fields lie beneath the cold darkness, resting beneath the same sky that has watched generations come and go. The bare trees stand along the edges of the fields. Their branches move gently whenever the wind passes through. Inside the small houses, the fires have become low. A few embers remain. The people who spent the day carrying wood, feeding animals, preparing food, repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and tending to their homes are now asleep. The long winter day has finally come to rest. There is no need for anything more tonight. The bowls have been washed. The tools have been put away. The doors have been closed. The animals are sheltered. The grain is stored. The blankets are pulled close. The hearth gives its final warmth. And for a little while, the entire village seems to breathe together. Slowly. Quietly. The wind moves across the roofs. A faint sound comes from the barn. Then silence returns. Far away, perhaps a river continues moving through the darkness. Its water does not stop for winter. It passes quietly beneath the cold air, carrying the season onward. The people sleeping beside the hearth do not need to see it. They do not need to know how far the river travels. They only need the warmth of the room, the weight of the blanket, the familiar sound of the house, the quiet breathing of the people nearby. Outside, the fields remain empty. But they are not forgotten. Under the frozen earth, the seeds wait. The soil rests. The roots remain hidden. The coming spring is already part of the world, even though it cannot yet be seen. The medieval year has always moved this way. Work. Harvest. Storage. Winter. Rest. Then, slowly, another beginning. But for tonight, there is nowhere to go. The road can remain empty. The fields can remain still. The tools can remain against the wall. The hands that worked all day can finally become still. The fire can become ash. The house can become quiet. And the winter darkness can remain outside. Perhaps snow begins to fall. One small flake. Then another. They settle on the roof. They settle on the road. They settle across the fields. The village becomes softer. The footprints disappear. The fences become pale. The trees become quiet shapes against the night. Inside, the last warmth of the hearth remains. Someone turns in sleep. A blanket moves softly. Then stillness again. The hours pass. Midnight comes. Then another hour. Then another. The darkness does not feel empty. It feels complete. The day has been lived. Nothing more needs to be done. And somewhere beyond the village, the river continues its slow journey beneath the winter sky. Its water moves through the darkness. Quietly. Patiently. Just as the seasons move. Just as generations move. Just as every winter eventually gives way to spring. But there is no need to follow the story any farther tonight. The village can sleep. The fields can rest. The animals can remain warm in their shelters. The people can remain beneath their blankets. And the fire can slowly fade. The final ember becomes smaller. Then smaller still. Until only a faint red glow remains beneath the ash. The house grows darker. The winter wind passes once more. Then moves away. And for a long while, there is nothing but the soft darkness of an ancient night. A quiet house. A quiet village. A quiet field. A quiet sky. And the slow, peaceful turning of the year. Sleep now, beneath the calm winter darkness. The long day has passed. The work is finished. The fire is resting. The village is still. And somewhere beneath the cold earth, spring is waiting patiently. For now, there is only night. Only silence. Only warmth. Only rest. And slowly, very slowly, the last light disappears.